If you were walking home late at night and heard the unmistakable sound of pain coming from a dark alley, would you have the courage to investigate? Or would you hurry past, telling yourself it's none of your business? Prepare yourself for a deeply moving story of struggle, redemption, and the unbreakable bond that can form between strangers in the most unexpected circumstances. This tale will take you through a journey of heartbreak and healing that might just change how you see the world around you. In the gritty outskirts of Portland, Oregon, where the rain seems to fall more often than not, a small tan and white pit bull, mixed with soulful brown eyes, had known nothing but cruelty. His name was Lucky, though there had been nothing fortunate about his short life so far. His ribs protruded sharply through his dull coat, and his eyes held the wary look of an animal that had learned to expect pain rather than kindness from human hands. The man who claimed to own Lucky was Marcus Denton, a 45-year-old with a volatile temper and a drinking problem that had cost him his job, his marriage, and most of his friends. Marcus kept Lucky chained in the small, cluttered backyard of his rundown apartment building, often forgetting to provide food or water for days at a time. When Marcus was angry, which was often, Lucky became the target of his frustration. Sarah Chen was 32, a pediatric nurse who had recently moved to Portland after a painful divorce. She worked the night shift at the local children's hospital and was walking home one rainy Thursday night, exhausted after a 12-hour shift. Sarah had always been the type of person who felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply for her own good, according to her ex-husband, who had eventually grown tired of what he called her bleeding heart. The alley where their lives would intersect ran between 2 blocks of aging apartment buildings, a shortcut that Sarah had taken to shave 5 minutes off her walk home. On this particular night, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the city with that peculiar glistening quality that made even the most mundane objects seem somehow transformed. Sarah had her headphones in, listening to a podcast to keep herself company on the walk. It was just after midnight when she first heard the sound, a sharp yelp of pain that cut through her podcast and made her stop in her tracks. Sarah paused her audio and listened, telling herself it was probably nothing, just the wind or perhaps a stray cat. But then she heard it again, followed by the sound of a man's angry voice and the unmistakable thud of something being struck. Her heart began to race as she approached the entrance to the alley. Sarah knew the smart thing would be to keep walking, to call the police perhaps, but not to put herself in potential danger. Yet something about that sound of pain, so raw and vulnerable, made it impossible for her to simply walk away. She took out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and cautiously stepped into the alley. The scene that greeted her was one that would be forever burned into her memory. A man stood with his back to her, swaying slightly as if drunk, and in his hand was a thick leather belt. At his feet, cowering and trembling, was a small dog, trying desperately to make itself as small as possible. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see patches of the dog's fur were dark, with what she instinctively knew was blood. "Hey!" The word burst from her lips before she had time to think, loud and sharp in the quiet night. The man spun around, his face contorted with rage and surprise. Lucky, seeing his tormentor distracted, pressed himself against the ground, his body shaking uncontrollably, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. In that moment, the dog's eyes met Sarah's, and something passed between them, a silent plea that Sarah couldn't have ignored if she tried. "Mind your own fucking business, lady," Marcus slurred, the belt still gripped tightly in his hand. The smell of cheap whiskey wafted from him, so strong that Sarah could smell it from where she stood at the entrance to the alley. She should have been afraid. He was much larger than her, clearly intoxicated and already violent. But all she could focus on was the trembling dog and the drops of blood on the wet pavement. Sarah had always considered herself an ordinary person, not particularly brave, not particularly strong, just someone trying to get through life as best she could. But standing there in that alley, her scrubs still bearing the stains from her shift, something shifted inside her. A line was being crossed, and she suddenly knew with absolute certainty that she could not, would not walk away and leave this animal to suffer. "I'm making it my business," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She raised her phone, making sure he could see it. "I'm calling the police right now and I'm recording everything." This was a bluff. She wasn't actually recording, but in the dim light and with his intoxicated state, she hoped he wouldn't be able to tell. Lucky had managed to crawl a few inches away from Marcus while his attention was diverted, leaving a small smear of blood on the pavement. Marcus took a menacing step toward her, but stumbled slightly, his intoxication affecting his balance. "This is my dog," he spat. "I can do whatever I want with him." The casual cruelty in his voice made Sarah's stomach turn, but she stood her ground. Lucky watched this exchange with wide, fearful eyes, his body still pressed to the ground, ready to absorb the next blow that he had learned would inevitably come. The rain began again, a light drizzle that fell softly around them, creating a strange, otherworldly atmosphere in the narrow alley. The sounds of the city seemed far away, and for a moment it was just the three of them, Sarah, Marcus, and the wounded dog whose life hung in the balance of what would happen next. Sarah's mind raced, calculating her options, weighing the risks against what her conscience was telling her she needed to do. "You don't understand," Marcus slurred, his grip tightening on the belt. "This mutt deserves it. Chewed up my boots. Good leather boots." His words made Sarah's blood boil, the justification so callous and absurd that she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Lucky, still trembling on the ground, had begun to make a soft whimpering sound that tore at Sarah's heart, a sound of pure fear and resignation that no living being should ever have to make. Sarah took a deliberate step forward, her phone still held out in front of her like a shield. "I'm not leaving without that dog," she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. In her years as a pediatric nurse, Sarah had encountered parents who hurt their children, and she had learned to recognize the signs of systematic abuse, the way Lucky cowered, the old scars visible beneath his patchy fur. This wasn't the first time he had been beaten. Marcus's face twisted with rage, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "You think you can just take my property?" he snarled, gesturing wildly with the belt. The sudden movement made Lucky flinch violently, a reflexive response born from expecting pain. Sarah noticed that the dog's left hind leg seemed to be bent at an odd angle, possibly broken from a previous beating or an accident that had gone untreated. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through Sarah's scrubs and making her shiver in the cool night air, but she barely noticed the discomfort, her attention fixed on the dog and the unstable man who stood between them. Marcus took another step toward her, this one more steady than the last, and Sarah felt a flicker of fear ignite in her chest. She thumbed the emergency call button on her phone, ready to dial 911 if necessary. Suddenly, the back door of one of the apartment buildings opened, spilling yellow light into the alley. "What's going on out here?" called an elderly man's voice. Marcus whirled around, momentarily distracted, and in that instant, Sarah made her decision. She lunged forward, closing the distance between herself and Lucky in 3 quick strides, and dropped to her knees beside the trembling dog. Lucky's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. He cowered even further, tucking his tail so tightly against his body that it seemed to disappear, and a low, fearful growl rumbled in his throat. His eyes, though, told a different story. There was fear there, yes, but also a desperate, faint glimmer of hope. Sarah reached out slowly, palm up, allowing him to smell her hand to understand that she meant no harm. "You crazy bitch," Marcus shouted, advancing toward them, but the elderly man was now fully in the alley, his frail figure silhouetted in the doorway. "I've called the police," the old man announced, though Sarah couldn't tell if this was true or another bluff like her own. Either way, it had an effect on Marcus, who hesitated, swaying unsteadily in the rain, rage and calculation visibly warring on his face. In that moment of hesitation, Sarah gathered Lucky into her arms as gently as she could. He was lighter than she expected, shockingly so, and she could feel every rib under her fingers as she cradled him against her chest. His body was rigid with fear, but he didn't bite or struggle, almost as if he understood that this stranger was his only chance at escape. The warm wetness of his blood seeped through Sarah's scrubs, but she held him firmly, rising to her feet with determination. "Put him down," Marcus demanded, his voice cracking like thunder in the confined space of the alley. He took a menacing step forward, raising the belt, but the elderly man had shuffled closer, his presence a complication that Marcus's alcohol-addled brain was struggling to process. Lucky trembled violently in Sarah's arms, his breath coming in quick, shallow pants, his eyes darting frantically between his abuser and this new person who held him. "The police are on their way," Sarah said, not knowing if it was true, but hoping that the repeated threat would be enough. "They'll be here any minute." She began backing away toward the other end of the alley, keeping her eyes fixed on Marcus, ready to run if he came at them. The old man, picking up on what was happening, moved to partially block Marcus's path, his frail body an unlikely but brave barrier. Marcus stood there, swaying, the rain plastering his thinning hair to his scalp, making him look smaller somehow, less threatening. "That's my dog," he repeated, but the words lacked conviction now. He glanced nervously toward the street, as if expecting to see police lights at any moment. Lucky, sensing the change in energy, pressed himself closer against Sarah's chest, seeking warmth and safety in this strange new embrace. The elderly man, who Sarah would later learn was named George Takahashi, a retired high school teacher who had lived in the building for over 40 years, stepped further into the alley. "I've seen you with that dog," he said to Marcus, his voice steady despite his age. "I've heard what you do to him. It stops tonight." There was a quiet authority in his voice, the kind that had probably once commanded classrooms of unruly teenagers, and it seemed to penetrate Marcus's drunken haze. Sarah continued her careful retreat, each step taking her and Lucky further from danger. She could feel the dog's racing heart against her own, could feel the way his body shook with fear and pain. "It's okay," she whispered to him, hoping that somehow he could understand the sentiment, if not the words. "You're safe now. I won't let him hurt you anymore." Lucky's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and though the trembling didn't stop, something in his posture softened almost imperceptibly. Marcus, realizing that he was now outnumbered and that there was a real possibility of police involvement, finally backed down. "Fine," he spat, his face contorted with rage and defeat. "Take the worthless mutt. He's nothing but trouble anyway." He kicked an empty beer can that lay on the ground, sending it clattering down the alley. "But don't come crying to me when he bites your face off. He's vicious, that one. Born bad." The cruel words hung in the air, a final attempt to wound and control, even as his power slipped away. With one last venomous glare, Marcus turned and staggered out of the alley, disappearing around the corner into the rainy night. Sarah stood there for a moment, half expecting him to return, but the alley remained empty except for her, George, and Lucky, who was now making a soft, whining sound that broke Sarah's heart. It wasn't until Marcus was truly gone that she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened and what she had just done. She was now responsible for this injured, terrified creature in her arms. "Let me help you," George said, approaching slowly so as not to frighten Lucky further. "I have some old towels in my apartment. You can use them to dry him off and see how badly he's hurt." His eyes were kind behind his wire-rimmed glasses, reflecting genuine concern for the trembling bundle in Sarah's arms. Lucky watched the elderly man with wary eyes, his body tensing slightly at this new potential threat. Sarah nodded gratefully, suddenly aware of how wet and cold she was, standing in the alley with a bleeding dog in her arms and no clear plan for what to do next. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't planning to—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain that she had just impulsively rescued a dog without any preparation or forethought about what would come next. They made their way to George's ground-floor apartment, a small but immaculately kept space filled with books and mementos from a long life well lived. Lucky remained rigid in Sarah's arms, his eyes darting frantically around this new environment, expecting danger at every turn. When Sarah tried to set him down on the towel George had spread on the kitchen floor, the dog yelped in pain and fear, trying desperately to scramble back into her arms despite his injuries. It's okay, Sarah soothed, gently restraining him to prevent further harm. Under the bright kitchen lights, Lucky's condition was even more heartbreaking than it had appeared in the dim alley. His tan and white coat was matted with blood and dirt, revealing multiple fresh wounds from the belt, as well as older scars. His left hind leg was indeed broken, though it appeared to be an old injury that had healed improperly, forcing him to bear weight at an awkward angle. George brought a bowl of water, which Lucky eyed suspiciously but made no move toward, his thirst overwhelmed by fear. "I've seen that man with him before," George said quietly, kneeling carefully beside them despite his arthritic knees. "I've heard the dog crying, but I'm ashamed to say I didn't do anything until tonight. At my age, confrontation isn't easy." His eyes were downcast, filled with regret for the suffering he had witnessed but not stopped. "You helped tonight when it mattered most," Sarah assured him, carefully examining Lucky's wounds. None seemed life-threatening, but several would need proper cleaning and possibly stitches. As a nurse, she knew basic wound care, but animal medicine was outside her expertise. Lucky would need a veterinarian, and soon. The dog flinched at every touch, but seemed to be slowly realizing that these humans were different from the one he had known. George made tea while Sarah cleaned Lucky's wounds as best she could with warm water and the antiseptic from George's first aid kit. Lucky endured the treatment stoically, only whimpering occasionally when she touched a particularly tender spot. His big brown eyes never left her face, as if searching for answers or reassurance. "What will you do with him?" George asked, setting a steaming mug of tea on the table nearby. Sarah paused, her hands gentle on Lucky's matted fur. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't just leave him, but my apartment doesn't allow pets, and he'll need a vet, medication, proper food." The practical challenges suddenly seemed overwhelming in the face of her impulsive rescue. Lucky sensed her uncertainty, his ears flattening slightly as if he could understand that his fate was once again hanging in the balance. "There's an emergency vet clinic on Burnside," George offered. "My daughter takes her cats there. It's expensive, but they're good people." He hesitated, then added, "I'd take him myself, but with my arthritis..." He gestured to his gnarled hands, the joints swollen with age and illness. Lucky watched this exchange intently, his eyes moving between the two humans who were discussing his future. Sarah looked down at Lucky, at his scarred body and wary eyes that still somehow held a spark of resilience. In that moment, something shifted within her, a decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I'll figure it out," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes, I'm not abandoning him." At her words, as if he understood their significance, Lucky's tail moved in the slightest wag. A tiny gesture of hope from a dog who had known little reason for it. George smiled, relief clear on his weathered face. "I have a car," he said. "I don't drive much these days, but it works fine. I can take you both to the vet right now." He was already reaching for his car keys, his earlier caution transformed into decisive action. Lucky tensed at the jingle of keys, perhaps associating the sound with Marcus's drunken returns home, but he didn't try to flee, his trust in Sarah growing by small increments. The emergency veterinary clinic was bright and sterile, the waiting room empty at this late hour, except for a young couple cradling a cat carrier. Lucky, wrapped in towels and still cradled in Sarah's arms, trembled at the strange smells and sounds, but remained surprisingly calm compared to his earlier terror. The staff reacted quickly once they saw his condition, whisking him into an examination room, where a young female veterinarian with kind eyes introduced herself as Dr. Morris. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated, Doctor," Morris said after a thorough examination, her voice professional but tinged with anger at the obvious signs of abuse. "The wounds from tonight will heal with proper care, but I'm more concerned about the old fracture in his leg and the signs of internal problems from long-term neglect." Lucky lay sedated on the examination table, his breathing finally steady for the first time since Sarah had found him. Sarah listened with growing horror as Dr. Morris detailed Lucky's conditions: heartworm disease, intestinal parasites, dental problems from poor nutrition, and muscle atrophy from being kept chained and unable to move properly. "He's young though, maybe 2 years old," the vet concluded. "With proper care, he has a good chance at recovery and a normal life." She paused, her expression softening. "Are you planning to keep him, or should I contact animal services?" The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that would change not just Lucky's life, but Sarah's as well. She thought of her small apartment, the no pets clause in her lease, her long shifts at the hospital, all the practical reasons why taking in a dog, especially one with special needs, was a terrible idea. Then she looked at Lucky, sedated but somehow still watching her with those soulful eyes, and remembered the moment in the alley when he had looked at her with that silent plea for help. "I'm keeping him," Sarah said, the words coming easily once she allowed herself to speak them. She filled out paperwork as Lucky underwent treatment, authorizing procedures that would cost far more than she had budgeted for the month. George waited with her, offering silent support and practical advice drawn from his daughter's experiences with rescue animals. By the time dawn broke, Lucky had been cleaned, treated, and prescribed a regimen of medications to begin his long journey to physical recovery. "He'll need to stay here for at least 2 days," Dr. Morris explained, leading Sarah to a recovery kennel where Lucky lay sleeping, an IV line delivering much-needed fluids and medication. "We need to stabilize him and monitor for any complications. After that, he'll need a quiet place to heal, regular medication, and eventually surgery for that leg." Lucky looked smaller and more vulnerable in the sterile environment, but also somehow more peaceful, as if his body had finally accepted that it was safe to rest. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind for Sarah. She called in sick to work for the first time in years, using her limited personal days to give herself time to prepare for Lucky's arrival. Her apartment manager was surprisingly understanding when she explained the situation, agreeing to make an exception to the no pets policy, provided she paid an additional security deposit. George introduced her to his daughter, Lisa, who worked at a local animal rescue and brought over donated supplies: a dog bed, bowls, a leash, and high-quality food appropriate for a dog recovering from malnutrition. 2 days later, Sarah returned to the clinic to bring Lucky home. The difference in him was already remarkable. His eyes were clearer, his movements less guarded, though still hampered by his injured leg. When he saw Sarah, his tail gave that same cautious wag, slightly stronger than before. Dr. Morris provided detailed instructions for his care and a schedule for follow-up appointments. "He's going to need a lot of patience," she warned gently. "Dogs from abusive situations often have behavioral issues that take time to resolve." Sarah's apartment felt different with Lucky in it, smaller yet somehow more like a home. She had set up his bed in the corner of her living room, but on the first night, after pacing anxiously for hours, Lucky finally settled on the floor beside her bed, seemingly needing to be close to her to feel secure. Sarah slipped down onto the floor beside him, gently stroking his head until they both fell asleep. It was the beginning of a new routine, one built around healing, both his and, unexpectedly, her own. The first week was challenging in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Lucky was terrified of sudden movements, cowering if she raised her hand too quickly to reach for something. He had accidents in the apartment, not yet understanding that he was allowed outside regularly. Loud noises sent him scrambling for cover, and he seemed confused by the concept of toys, sniffing suspiciously at the soft plush squirrel Lisa had included in the donation box. Most heartrending of all, he still expected punishment for every perceived transgression, trembling violently if he spilled water or chewed something he shouldn't. "It's okay, buddy," Sarah would say, kneeling at a distance to avoid frightening him further. "No one's going to hurt you, not ever again." At first, the words seemed to mean nothing to him, but gradually, day by day, something began to change. Lucky started to recover physically, his wounds healing, his coat growing shinier with proper nutrition, his eyes brighter and more engaged with the world around him. The psychological scars would take longer to fade, but there were small victories each day. The first time Lucky wagged his tail enthusiastically was when Sarah returned home from her shift at the hospital a week and a half after bringing him home. The clear recognition and happiness in that gesture brought tears to her eyes. 3 days later, he tentatively licked her hand while she was filling his food bowl, a display of affection that felt monumental. The first time he played with the squirrel toy, awkwardly pawing at it before picking it up and bringing it to her with cautious pride, Sarah called George immediately to share the news, both of them celebrating this simple act as the milestone it truly was. Weekly visits to Dr. Morris tracked Lucky's physical improvement, and after a month he was strong enough for the surgery to repair his improperly healed leg. Sarah was terrified at the thought of him waking up in pain and confusion without her there, but Dr. Morris assured her the procedure was routine and necessary for his long-term mobility. The surgery was successful, though it meant another 6 weeks of limited movement and careful rehabilitation to ensure proper healing this time. During Lucky's recovery, Sarah discovered an unexpected talent for physical therapy techniques adapted for canines. Her nursing background proved invaluable as she worked with him daily on gentle exercises to strengthen his leg muscles without putting weight on the healing bone. Lucky was a determined patient, pushing through discomfort with a stoic resilience that amazed both Sarah and Dr. Morris. "He wants to get better," the vet observed during a checkup. "He has something to live for now, Sarah found herself changed by Lucky's presence in ways she hadn't expected. Her apartment, once a quiet refuge from the emotional demands of her work with sick children, became a space filled with small joys. Lucky's growing confidence exploring each room, his curious sniffing of everything she brought home, the way he had started to greet her at the door with what could only be described as a smile, his mouth open and relaxed in a way it never had been before. 3 months after the night in the alley, Sarah received a phone call from the local district attorney's office. Someone, she suspected George, had reported Marcus for animal abuse, and with the veterinary documentation of Lucky's injuries and Sarah's testimony, they were pursuing charges. The prosecutor warned her that such cases were often difficult to win, but the evidence was strong, and they believed they had a case. Lucky, sensing her distress during the call, came and leaned against her legs. His warm presence a comfort she hadn't known she needed. The court case dragged on for weeks, bureaucratic delays and legal maneuvering, stretching what should have been a straightforward process into a stressful ordeal. Sarah had to relive that rainy night in detail, describing Lucky's condition and Marcus's threats. Through it all, Lucky continued to heal and grow stronger. The frightened, broken dog from the alley was transforming into a confident, affectionate companion who greeted each day with increasing enthusiasm, his dark past receding like a tide going out. When the verdict finally came, guilty, with a fine and probation that included a ban on pet ownership, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. That evening, she and Lucky went to the dog park for the first time, a milestone they had been building toward for months. Lucky's leg was almost fully healed, though he would always have a slight limp, a physical reminder of his past that didn't seem to diminish his joy in the present. He approached other dogs cautiously, but with growing confidence, his tail held high as he navigated this new social world. 6 months to the day after the rescue, Sarah hosted a small gathering at her apartment. George and his daughter, Lisa, Dr. Morris, and a few co-workers who had become invested in Lucky's journey through Sarah's stories and photos. Lucky, once too fearful to tolerate strangers in his space, now moved from person to person, accepting gentle pets and quietly absorbing the affection offered to him. He still had moments of fear. A raised voice or a dropped object could send him retreating to his safe spot under Sarah's bed, but these episodes were becoming rarer and shorter in duration. 1 year after that fateful night in the alley, Lucky bore little resemblance to the broken creature Sarah had cradled in her arms. His coat was glossy and full, his body strong and healthy, his eyes clear and bright with intelligence and trust. He still carried physical reminders of his past, the limp that became more pronounced when he was tired, the scars visible beneath his fur, the way his ears flattened at certain sounds. But these were merely footnotes to his story now, not its defining chapters. Sarah had changed too. Her apartment now displayed framed photos of Lucky at various stages of his recovery, sleeping in a patch of sunlight on her bed, proudly holding his favorite toy, playing in the snow during their first winter together. She had become involved with a local animal rescue group through Lisa, occasionally fostering dogs and cats in need of temporary homes before adoption. Her co-workers at the hospital noted a new confidence in her demeanor, a certainty about her place in the world that had been absent before. Their routine had solidified into comfortable patterns that anchored them both. Morning walks before Sarah's shift, evening training sessions that were as much about building trust as teaching commands, weekend hikes in the forests outside Portland where Lucky could run freely, his formerly broken leg now strong enough to carry him over fallen logs and up steep trails. He had developed quirks and preferences that delighted Sarah, a fondness for classical music, an intense dislike of the vacuum cleaner, an uncanny ability to know when she was feeling sad and needed the comfort of his warm presence against her side. On difficult days at the hospital, when Sarah lost a patient or watched a child suffer through painful treatments, she would come home to Lucky's unwavering welcome, his simple joy at her return a balm to her spirit. "You saved me too, you know," she would tell him, scratching behind his ears in the way that made his eyes close in contentment. In the darkest moments of her post-divorce depression, before Lucky came into her life, Sarah had felt adrift and purposeless, going through the motions of living without truly engaging with life. Now each day held meaning, small joys and responsibilities that extended beyond herself. George had become a regular visitor, often joining them for walks when his arthritis permitted. "He's a miracle," the old man would say, watching Lucky bound ahead on the path. Sarah always corrected him gently. "Not a miracle, just proof of what love and patience can do." But privately, she sometimes thought of it as miraculous, the transformation from the terrified, abused animal in the alley to this confident, loving dog who approached life with enthusiasm despite all he had endured. The most profound change, perhaps, was in Lucky's capacity for trust. The dog who had once cowered at a raised hand now rolled over for belly rubs from children at the park. The animal who had trembled at the sound of a man's voice now greeted Sarah's male friends with a wagging tail and curious sniffs. He had learned to play, to rest without vigilance, to expect good things from the world, lessons that had seemed impossible during those first difficult weeks of recovery. Dr. Morris, during Lucky's annual checkup, had tears in her eyes as she examined the now healthy dog. "In 15 years of veterinary practice, I've rarely seen such a complete recovery, physically and emotionally," she told Sarah. "You've given him an extraordinary second chance." Lucky, sensing the emotion in the room, pressed himself against Sarah's legs, looking up at her with an expression that seemed to contain all the gratitude and love his canine heart could hold. What Sarah had come to understand, through the long months of Lucky's healing, was that courage comes in many forms. There had been courage in that moment in the alley when she refused to walk away, yes, but there was equal courage in Lucky's willingness to trust again after betrayal, to try again after failure, to love again after abuse. Each small step he took toward recovery required its own kind of bravery, a daily choice to move forward rather than remain trapped in the pain of the past. As Lucky's story spread through Sarah's social circle and the veterinary practice, other rescued animals found homes, other abused pets were reported and saved. George, inspired by Lucky's transformation, had started volunteering at the local animal shelter despite his arthritis, reading to nervous dogs to help socialize them. "One person can't save them all," he told Sarah, "but each one saved matters to that animal." Lucky's journey had created ripples that extended far beyond their small household, touching lives neither of them would ever know. And so, on the anniversary of their meeting, Sarah took Lucky to a quiet spot by the river where they often walked. As the setting sun painted the water with gold and orange, she watched him explore the shoreline, ears pricked forward with interest, movements fluid and confident despite his old injury. In that moment, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. Sometimes the most important crossroads in life aren't marked with signs, she reflected. Sometimes they're just dark alleys on rainy nights, where the choice to stop instead of walk away changes everything.